Chapter 1. The Taint of Silence. The copper tang of dried blood and the pungent, earthy musk of crushed yarrow clung to the stone walls of the healer's hut, a smell that had become Arielle's only constant. She pressed a damp cloth against the workstation, scrubbing until the wood grain groaned under her grip. Outside the heavy oak door, the silver moon pack hummed with the vibrant energy of a spring afternoon, but inside this sanctuary of the sick, the air felt stagnant and heavy. Every few minutes, the floorboards vibrated with the heavy tread of warriors passing by, their laughter filtering through the cracks like shards of broken glass. Arielle kept her head low, her dark hair shielding a face that most people in this village preferred to forget. Because the shadows of her past were longer than the trees at twilight, she had learned to move like a ghost among the living. A young boy, barely 7 years old, sat on a wooden stool near the hearth, his knee scraped raw from a tumble during training. He was a small thing, smelling of pine needles and puppy fat, his eyes wide with the tears he was trying so hard to suppress. Arielle reached for a jar of soothing salve, her fingers trembling slightly with a warmth she rarely allowed herself to feel. She offered a small, tentative smile, hoping to bridge the chasm that the pack had dug between her and the rest of the world. "This will sting for just a heartbeat," she whispered, her voice husky from hours of disuse. As she reached out to dab the medicine onto his skin, the boy's mother appeared in the doorway, her silhouette blocking the golden sunlight. The woman didn't speak. She simply lunged forward and snatched her son's arm away with such force that the stool skidded across the floor. She stared at Arielle with eyes that burned like cold embers, a mixture of primal fear and deep-seated disgust etched into her features. The woman's upper lip curled, revealing teeth that were just a second away from shifting into a snarl. She pulled the child against her hip, shielding him as if Arielle were a plague-carrying rat rather than a girl who had spent the morning brewing tea for the elderly. "Do not lay your tainted hands on my blood," the mother hissed, her voice vibrating with a low, guttural warning. "We know who you are, Arielle. We remember what your mother did to this pack. Traitors do not get to touch our future." Arielle froze, her hand still suspended in the empty air where the boy's leg had been. The silence that followed was a physical weight, pressing against her lungs until it hurt to draw a breath. She watched them leave, the boy looking back over his shoulder with a confusion that would eventually turn into the same hatred his mother carried. Because reputation was a currency she had never been allowed to earn, she felt the familiar sting of rejection settle into the marrow of her bones. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury for those who expected comfort, and Arielle had learned long ago that the only person coming to save her was herself. She turned back to the workstation, her movements mechanical and precise as she organized the glass vials. The rejection wasn't new, yet it felt sharper today, slicing through the thin armor of indifference she had spent years weaving. She could hear the village crier beginning the announcement for the spring mating gathering, his voice booming across the clearing. The event was supposed to be a celebration of new beginnings and divine matches, but for Arielle, it was simply another stage for her public isolation. She wondered if the moon goddess even saw her anymore, or if she too had turned her back when the first accusations were leveled against her bloodline. The scent of wood smoke and roasting meat began to drift through the window, signaling the start of the festivities. Arielle tightened her grip on the cleaning rag, the rough fabric scratching her palms. She would have to go, not because she wanted a mate, but because staying away would be an admission of the very weakness they accused her of possessing. She had to show them that she was still standing, even if she was standing in the ruins of a life she never got to choose. The heavy iron bell atop the Alpha's hall began to toll, its deep, resonant chime echoing through the valley and signaling that the fate of every unmated wolf was about to be decided. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Crown. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows across the bedroom walls as Arielle stared at the simple linen dress laid out on her narrow cot. It was a pale, dusty blue, the color of a bruised sky, and it felt like a funeral shroud against her skin. Her friend Alara sat on the edge of the small table, swinging her legs with an agitation that set Arielle's nerves on edge. Elara was the only soul in the pack who dared to speak to her without a sneer, a bond forged in the quiet corners of the library where the politics of the council couldn't reach them. "You have to go, Ari, because if you hide in this hut, you're giving them exactly what they want," Elara insisted, her voice sharp with a protective edge. "They want you to disappear. They want to believe that the traitor's daughter has finally crawled into a hole to die of shame. If you don't show up at that gathering, you are handing them the victory on a silver platter." Arielle let out a dry, mirthless laugh, her fingers tracing the frayed hem of her sleeve. "Victory? Elara, there is no winning for me. If I go, I stand in a circle while men look through me like I'm made of glass. If I stay, I'm a coward. I'd rather be a coward in the dark than a laughingstock in the light." The tension between them was a physical cord, pulling tight as the distant sound of drums began to thrum from the center of the village. Arielle's sarcasm was a shield, a jagged wall of words designed to keep the world at bay, but even she could feel the cracks forming. She thought of her mother, the way she had looked when the warriors dragged her toward the border. No trial, no evidence, just the word of a council that valued order over truth. Because loyalty in this pack was a political weapon, Arielle knew that her presence at the gathering was a dangerous gamble. "I'm not asking you to find a husband," Elara softened, stepping closer and placing a hand on Arielle's shoulder. "I'm asking you to occupy the space you were born into. Don't let them erase you before you've even had a chance to live." Arielle sighed, the sound echoing the exhaustion that lived deep in her chest. She pulled the dress over her head, the fabric feeling heavy and restrictive. She didn't use a mirror. She didn't need to see the dark circles under her eyes or the way her jaw was set in a permanent line of defiance. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the wind shifted, bringing a new scent that cut through the smell of roasted meat and pine. It was something dark, metallic, and overwhelming, the scent of cold rain on slate and the iron tang of ancient power. Suddenly, the crowd near the village gates parted like a sea before a storm. A group of warriors marched in, their furs matted with dried mud and the evidence of a long patrol on the rogue borders. At their head walked Kael, the alpha heir whose name was whispered with equal parts awe and terror. He was a man built of sharp angles and hard shadows, his presence so commanding that the air seemed to thin in his wake. He didn't look at the cheering crowd. His gaze was fixed forward, his expression a mask of icy control that suggested he had seen things in the dark that no civilized wolf should know. Arielle felt a strange, frantic pulse in her throat as he passed by, a primal recognition that made her wolf stir for the first time in years. Kael was the personification of everything that kept her oppressed, the law, the power, and the legacy of the men who had destroyed her family. He was the sun, and she was the rot in the cellar, yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scars that tracked across his jaw. He looked weary, a king carrying a crown of thorns, and for a split second, Arielle wondered if he felt as trapped by his status as she did by her shame. The drums grew louder, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to pull her toward the clearing where the fate of her future waited in the flickering orange glow of the bonfires. Chapter 3. The Claiming Storm. The great clearing was a sea of shifting bodies and heated breath, the air thick with the scent of pheromones and nervous sweat. Arielle stood on the periphery, her back pressed against a gnarled oak tree that offered a modicum of shadow. The young males of the pack were preening, their chests puffed out as they paraded past the line of unmated females. It was a meat market, a traditional display of strength and fertility that made Arielle's stomach churn with a cold, acidic bile. She watched as a group of warriors laughed, their eyes darting toward her with a cruelty that was as sharp as any blade. A tall, broad-shouldered wolf named Torin stepped out of the group, his gait arrogant and heavy. He made a direct line for Arielle, his sneer widening as he approached. He was the son of a high-ranking elder, a man who had been vocal about purging the tainted blood from their ranks. When he reached her, he didn't ask. He lunged forward and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin with a bruising force. He hauled her forward into the light of the main bonfire, forcing her to face the judgmental stares of the entire pack. "Look at this," Torin barked, his voice carrying over the music and the chatter. "The traitor's brat thinks she can stand among us. Who would ever want a mate whose mother sold our secrets for a handful of silver? No one would ever claim a dog like her? The laughter that followed was a physical blow, a chorus of mockery that echoed off the surrounding cliffs. Arielle felt the heat of the fire on her face, but her insides were turning to ice. She tried to wrench her arm free, but Torin's grip was like an iron shackle. She looked for a friendly face, a single soul who might object, but even Alara was lost in the crowd, her expression one of helpless horror. Because her worth was negotiable in the eyes of these people, she felt the final pillars of her pride beginning to crumble into the dirt. The laughter died a sudden, violent death. A silence so profound it seemed to swallow the crackle of the flames descended over the clearing. Kael stepped into the circle, his movements fluid and predatory, his eyes glowing with a subterranean gold that signaled his wolf was at the surface. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Torin's hand, which was still clamped around Arielle's wrist. The air around the alpha heir seemed to vibrate with a lethal frequency, a pressure that made the surrounding wolves drop their heads in instinctive submission. "Let her go," Kael said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that wasn't a request. Torin's face went pale, his arrogance vanishing as he felt the sheer weight of Kael's authority. He released Arielle as if she had suddenly turned into white-hot coal, stumbling back into the shadows of the crowd. Arielle stood trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected Kael to keep walking, to dismiss her with the same cold indifference he showed everyone else. Instead, he stepped closer, his scent of rain and iron wrapping around her like a protective cloak. He reached out, his large, calloused hand moving with a gentleness that felt completely alien in this brutal place. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the red marks Torin had left behind, and a jolt of electricity surged through Arielle's body, a sensation so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. Kael looked her directly in the eyes, his gaze searching hers with an intensity that stripped away every defense she had ever built. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming with a finality that shook the very ground. "My mate," he declared, the words echoing through the silent forest. A collective gasp ripped through the pack, followed by a stunned, heavy silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. The elders stared in open outrage, their faces twisting as they realized the most powerful man in their world had just chosen the girl they hated most. Arielle looked up at Kael, her mind a whirlwind of shock, terror, and a burgeoning suspicion she couldn't name. He didn't look like a man who had found his soulmate. He looked like a man who had just declared war on his own kingdom. The firelight flickered in his golden eyes, casting a shadow over the path they were now forced to walk together. Chapter 4. The Architect of Scandal. The morning sun bled through the cracks of the healer's hut, but the warmth felt like a mockery against the cold dread pooling in Arielle's stomach. News in the pack traveled faster than a forest fire, and by dawn, she was no longer the invisible traitor. She was the girl who had ensnared a king. She paced the small confines of her room, her fingers tracing the faint, ghostly outline of Kael's touch on her skin. Because her life had been a series of calculated cruelties, she couldn't accept that his declaration was born of anything resembling affection. To Arielle, a man like Kael did not choose a mate. He selected a chess piece, and she was currently being moved across a board she didn't understand. The door creaked open, admitting a sliver of gray light and the heavy, authoritative scent of the Alpha's personal guard. Two warriors stood there, their faces unreadable masks of stone, gesturing for her to follow. She didn't ask where they were going, mainly because the answer was written in the rigid set of their shoulders and the way they refused to meet her eyes. They led her through the village, where the usual whispers had evolved into a deafening, hostile silence. Women clutched their children tighter as she passed, and the men spat into the dirt, their eyes burning with the belief that she had used some dark, ancestral magic to bewitch their future leader. They reached the Great Hall, a towering structure of ancient pine and bone, where Kael stood atop the dais, looking down at the gathered council. He looked different in the harsh light of day, less like a savior and more like a conqueror claiming a prize he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. His father, the reigning Alpha Silas, sat in the high chair, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, lethal beat against the wood. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old blood and stagnant tradition, a pressure that made Arielle's lungs feel like they were being squeezed by a vice. "You cannot be serious, Kael," Silas roared, his voice bouncing off the rafters like a physical blow. "To claim her is to spit on the graves of every warrior who died because of her mother's treachery. You are the alpha heir. Your blood is a legacy, not a charity project for the broken." Kael didn't flinch, his posture as straight and unyielding as a mountain ridge. "The moon goddess does not check political ledgers before she binds two souls, father." I smelled her. I felt the pull. "I am formally announcing my intent to claim Arielle at the next full moon, and I will hear no further debate on the validity of my instincts." Arielle felt a surge of hot, rebellious anger flare in her chest at the way they spoke about her as if she were a piece of livestock being bartered over a fence. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "And what if I refuse? What if I don't want to be the tool you use to prove your independence to your father?" The room went deathly still, the council members staring at her as if she had just grown a second head. Kael turned to her, his golden eyes narrowing, a flicker of something that looked like respect, or perhaps just surprise, crossing his face. Because she had spent her life being told she was nothing, the act of speaking back felt like a small, desperate revolution. Kael stepped down from the dais, his presence expanding until he occupied every inch of her personal space, his heat radiating through her thin dress. "You won't refuse," he whispered, his voice low and vibrating with a power that made her wolf whine in submission. "Because outside of this hall you are a target. Within my shadow you are a queen. Choose your cage wisely, Arielle." Chapter 5. The Shadow of the Council. The evening air was thick with the scent of damp earth and coming rain, a heavy atmosphere that mirrored the suffocating tension within the pack. Arielle found herself lurking in the shadows of the council chamber's exterior, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had come looking for answers, but the voices drifting through the high, narrow windows were delivering a death sentence instead. Because she had been raised on the bread of betrayal, she knew better than to trust the outward calm of the village elders. She pressed her ear against the cold stone, her breath hitching as she recognized the gravelly tone of Elder Bram, the man who had signed her mother's exile. "We cannot allow the claiming to proceed," Bram hissed, the words dripping with a venomous urgency. "If the traitor's blood sits on the throne, the very foundations of the Silver Moon will crumble. We must provoke a rejection. If she is shamed publicly during the ceremony, the bond will fracture, and Kael will be forced to choose a more appropriate mate to maintain his authority." "And if she doesn't break?" Another voice questioned, its tone edged with a cruel curiosity. "The girl has survived years of our contempt. She is made of harder stuff than her mother was." "Then we remind her of what happens to those who overstep," Bram replied, a low, guttural sound of amusement following his statement. "We make the price of her staying so high that she will run into the forest just to escape the fire. Fear is a far better teacher than loyalty, and she has a very long memory of what we are capable of doing to her kin." Arielle pulled away from the wall, her hands shaking so violently she had to bury them in her skirts to keep from screaming. The betrayal was so casual, so systematic, that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her skull. They weren't just planning to reject her. They were planning to destroy the last shred of dignity she had managed to hoard in the dark. Because panic was a familiar companion, it took hold of her now, whispering that she was a fool to ever think Kael's protection was real. He was likely in on it, a part of the grand design to finally rid the pack of the taint her family represented. She turned and ran, her feet flying over the pine needles as she headed toward the only place where the pack's laws didn't reach. The border of the rogue territory was a jagged line of silver-leafed trees, a boundary that even the bravest warriors hesitated to cross. Her breath came in ragged, burning gasps, each one a testament to the terror that was now her only reality. She didn't have a plan. She only had the primal urge to be gone before the elders could turn her soul into a public spectacle. The forest grew denser, the light of the moon struggling to penetrate the thick canopy of ancient oaks. The sounds of the village faded, replaced by the eerie, unnatural silence of the neutral zone where the outcasts and the monsters dwelled. Arielle stopped at the edge of a deep ravine, her lungs searing, her mind a chaotic blur of Kael's golden eyes and Bram's lethal promises. She felt the shift in the air before she heard the sound, a low, rhythmic snapping of twigs that suggested something large and hungry was tracking her scent. "Is this what you wanted?" She screamed into the darkness, her voice cracking with the weight of her despair. "To see me run like a dog? Well, I'm gone. Are you happy now?" The silence that followed was broken by a low, terrifying growl that didn't come from a pack wolf. It was deeper, more jagged, and carried the stench of rot and madness. Out of the shadows stepped a rogue, his fur matted with filth, his eyes clouded with the bloodlust that came from a broken mind. He lunged, a blur of gray and teeth, and Arielle realized with a sickening finality that in her quest to escape the hunters of her home, she had delivered herself directly into the jaws of a beast. Chapter 6. The Price of Pride. The rogue's weight slammed into Arielle, throwing her backward into the dirt with a force that knocked the air from her chest. She scrambled in the mud, her fingers clawing at the earth as the beast's hot, rancid breath washed over her face. This was the reality of her world. One predator replaced by another, each one sensing the lesser quality of her blood. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable tear of teeth against her throat, her mind flashing one last time to the image of Kael standing on the dais. Because she had always expected to die alone, the sudden explosion of sound from the underbrush felt like a hallucination. A roar that shook the very trees ripped through the clearing, followed by the terrifying sound of snapping bone and tearing flesh. Arielle opened her eyes to see a massive black wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, pinning the rogue to the ground. It was Kael, not the restrained heir she had seen in the hall, but a primal force of nature, his fur like midnight and his eyes burning like twin suns. He didn't just fight the rogue, he dismantled it with a brutal clinical efficiency that turned the clearing into a slaughterhouse. The rogue didn't stand a chance against the alpha's fury, its body eventually going limp under Kael's massive paws. Kael didn't shift back immediately. He stood over the carcass, his chest heaving, his muzzle stained with the blood of the creature that had dared to touch his mate. He turned his head toward Arielle, his gaze so intense that she felt the mate bond snap fully into place, a golden cord of fire that linked her soul to his. It was a terrifying, beautiful weight, a connection that told her he felt her fear, her pain, and her bone-deep exhaustion. He shifted in a blur of motion, his human form appearing as if from the shadows themselves, naked and unashamed in the moonlight. He strode toward her, his face a mask of such raw, unchecked emotion that she instinctively shrank back. He didn't stop until he was looming over her, his hands reaching out to pull her to her feet with a grip that was firm but no longer bruising. He searched her face for injuries, his thumb tracing a small scratch on her cheek with a reverence that made her heart skip a beat. "Why did you run?" he demanded, his voice a jagged edge of pain and anger. "Do you have any idea what they would have done to you out here? You are mine, Arielle. Do you think I would let you be taken by a piece of filth like that?" "I heard them, Kael," she spat, her own anger rising to meet his. "I heard the elders. They're going to humiliate me. They're going to make sure you reject me. Why would I stay for that? Why would I let you have the satisfaction of throwing me away in front of everyone?" Kael froze, his eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like sorrow. He stepped closer, his forehead resting against hers, the scent of rain and iron now mixed with the metallic tang of the rogue's blood. Because he had been raised to value power above all things, the admission he made next felt like a crack in the very foundation of his identity. He didn't look like an alpha in that moment. He looked like a man who was terrified of losing the only light he had ever found in the dark. "They cannot make me do anything," he whispered against her skin, his breath warm and steady. "They think they own the crown, but they don't own me. I didn't choose you for the pack, Arielle." I chose you for me. If the cost of keeping you is the throne, then let it burn. I would rather be a rogue with you than a king without you." The sincerity in his voice was a physical blow, a truth that threatened to shatter every defense Arielle had ever built. She wanted to believe him, but the ghosts of her mother's past were still screaming in her ears, reminding her that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. She looked at the blood on his hands, the evidence of the violence he was willing to commit in her name, and felt a terrifying shift in her own heart. She wasn't safe, and she wasn't wanted by the world, but in the arms of the man who had just killed for her, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a decade. A reason to stop running. Chapter 7. The Savage Grace. The moon hung like a silver sickle over the training grounds, casting a cold, ethereal glow on the frost-dusted grass. Arielle stood in the center of the clearing, her breath coming in short, white plumes that vanished into the night air. Beside her, Kael moved with the silent, fluid grace of a shadow, his presence a constant heat against her left side. Because her wolf had been suppressed by years of shame and malnutrition, the creature within felt like a wild, wounded thing scratching at the bars of her ribs. She had never been taught the sacred art of the shift, left instead to endure the agonizing, bone-snapping transitions in the dark corners of the healer's hut. "Focus on the heartbeat, not the pain," Kael murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground her racing pulse. "The shift isn't a battle you win, Arielle. It's a surrender. Your wolf isn't a separate entity. She is the truth of who you are when the world stops watching." Arielle let out a jagged breath, her knees buckling as the first wave of heat rolled through her marrow. Usually, this was where the terror took over, the memory of her mother's screams during her final shift haunting every nerve ending. But today, Kael's hand was a steady weight on her shoulder, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone with a tenderness that confused her senses. Because he had promised to be her anchor, she allowed herself to lean into the sensation of her skeleton lengthening, the agony replaced by a terrifying electric vitality. With a final, guttural cry, the world tilted and expanded. The scents of the forest, the damp rot of leaves, the metallic tang of Kael's blood, the sweet sap of the pines, exploded in her mind with 1,000 times their usual intensity. She was on 4 paws, her fur a shimmering smoky gray that mirrored the mist rising from the valley floor. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small or tainted. She felt powerful, a predator carved from the very moonlight that had once made her feel exposed. Kael shifted beside her, his massive black form a comforting silhouette against the trees. He nudged her muzzle with his own, a gesture of primal recognition that sent a shiver of pure, unadulterated heat through her new body. They ran then, a blur of fur and muscle through the underbrush, the wind whipping through their coats as they pushed toward the higher ridges. Because she felt safe under his watchful eye, Arielle pushed herself faster, her paws thudding against the earth in a rhythmic song of liberation. For a few fleeting hours, the politics of the pack and the stains of the past were left in the dirt behind them. Chapter 8. The Serpent in the Garden. The euphoria of the mountain run vanished the moment Arielle stepped back into the village, replaced by a cold, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She was heading toward the well, her body aching with a pleasant fatigue when a shadow detached itself from the side of the granary. It was Julian, the alpha of the rival Black Ridge pack, a man whose smile was as sharp and predatory as a shark's fin. He had been a guest of the Silver Moon for 3 days, ostensibly to discuss border trade, but his eyes had followed Arielle with a calculating hunger that made her skin crawl. "It's a beautiful sight, seeing a broken bird finally find its wings," Julian drawled, his voice like silk over gravel. "But I wonder, Arielle, do you know whose blood was spilled to build the nest you're currently hiding in?" Arielle stopped, her hand tightening around the handle of her wooden bucket. "I have no business with you, Julian. My life is not a topic for your entertainment." "Oh, I think it is," Julian countered, stepping into her path, his scent of sulfur and old leather overwhelming the fresh pine of the forest. "You believe Kael is your savior, don't you? You think his father is just a stern leader doing his best for the pack. But what if I told you that your mother wasn't a traitor because of what she stole, but because of what she knew? What if the frame job that destroyed your family was signed in the very blood Kael carries in his veins? The bucket slipped from Arielle's hand, the water splashing over her boots in a cold, mocking wave. Because she had always suspected there was a hole in the story of her mother's betrayal, the words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Julian leaned in closer, his eyes dancing with the malicious joy of a man who loved to watch things burn. He whispered a name, a date, and a location, details so specific they felt like a key turning in a lock she had been trying to pick for a decade. Kael knows, of course, Julian added, his grin widening. He's his father's son, after all. Why do you think he claimed you so suddenly? Perhaps it wasn't the moon goddess? Perhaps it was just a way to keep the evidence close enough to smother if it ever started to scream. Arielle didn't wait for him to finish. She turned and ran, the whispers of the village now sounding like the hissing of snakes. Her mind was a chaotic storm of Kael's gentle touches and Julian's lethal accusations. Because trust was a foreign language she had only just started to learn, the possibility of this betrayal felt more real than the love Kael had promised. She needed to know the truth, even if it meant digging up the graves she had spent her life trying to bury. Chapter 9. The Ledger of Lies. The Alpha's private study was a room of heavy oak and secrets, smelling of old parchment and the expensive tobacco Silas favored. Arielle slipped through the shadows, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her movements as silent as the wolf she had only recently discovered. She knew Kael was at the border patrol, and Silas was in a council meeting. This was her only window to find the proof Julian had promised. Because she was a creature of the margins, she knew exactly where men like Silas hid the things they were most ashamed of, the bottom drawer, behind the false back of the cabinet. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age and stained with something dark and rust-colored. She flipped through the dates, her eyes searching for the month of her mother's exile. There, in the familiar, cramped handwriting of the Alpha, were the records of the border incident. But the names didn't match the public story. The supplies that were supposedly sold to the rogues weren't stolen by her mother. They were moved by Silas's own guard to fund a private war against a neighboring pack. And there, at the bottom of the page, was the crushing blow, a signature of acknowledgement from the Alpha heir, dated 3 years ago. Kael had seen these records. He had known for years that her mother was a scapegoat, a sacrifice made to protect the honor of the lineage he was so proud of. Because she had allowed herself to believe she was finally being chosen for her own worth, the realization that she was likely a pawn in a game of guilt management shattered her. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Arielle spun around, the ledger clutched to her chest like a shield. Kael stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dying light of the afternoon sun. He looked tired, his hair windswept, his eyes searching hers with a sudden, sharp concern. He saw the book in her hands, and for a split second, the mask of the stoic Alpha heir slipped, revealing a raw, jagged flash of panic. "Arielle, put that down," he said, his voice low and cautious, the same tone he used when approaching a wounded animal. "You don't understand the context of those records. There were lives at stake. The stability of the entire pack depended on a unified front." "My mother's life was at stake," Arielle screamed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. You knew she was innocent, and you watched me eat dirt for 10 years. You watched them spit on me, and you didn't say a word until you realized the secret might get out. Is that what I am to you, Kael? A cleanup crew for your father's sins?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken betrayals. Kael took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, but Arielle recoiled as if he were a leper. The golden bond between them, once a source of warmth, now felt like a chain of burning iron. Because she had spent her life being rejected by the world, being betrayed by the one man who claimed to love her, was the final breaking straw. She threw the ledger at his feet, the pages fluttering like the wings of a dying bird, and bolted past him into the deepening gloom of the corridor. Chapter 10. The Fragility of Truth. The air in the healer's hut felt thinner than it had yesterday. Every breath Arielle took tasting of the bitter herbs she was grinding into a fine, gray powder. Because she had discovered the blood-stained ink of Kael's silence, the very walls of the village seemed to be leaning inward, threatening to crush her under the weight of their collective lies. She worked with a feverish, frantic energy, the pestle striking the mortar with a rhythmic crack that echoed the fracturing of her own heart. She didn't look up when the door creaked open, though the scent of rain and heavy iron told her exactly who was standing in the shadows of the entryway. "You shouldn't be here," Arielle said, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. "There are no wounds here that you know how to heal, Alpha." Kael stepped into the dim light, his presence as overwhelming as a thundercloud, his eyes searching her face for a crack in the icy mask she had donned. "I didn't come here as your Alpha, Arielle. I came because the bond is screaming, and I can feel your soul pulling away from mine like a ship caught in a gale. You found the ledger, yes, but you didn't find the whole story because my father only writes the parts that make him look like a god." Arielle stopped her grinding, her knuckles white as she gripped the stone tool. "Does the whole story change the fact that my mother died in a ditch while you sat in your high hall and polished your father's lies? Does it change the fact that every time you touched me, you knew your blood was built on the wreckage of mine?" The tension in the room was a physical entity, a jagged blade suspended by a single fraying thread. Kael took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch her hair, but he caught himself, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. He looked weary, the lines around his mouth deeper than they had been when he first returned from the border. Because he was a man who had been groomed to value the pack's survival above his own morality, the guilt in his gaze was a raw, bleeding thing that Arielle found herself wanting to both salt and soothe. "My father would have killed her that night if I hadn't agreed to the exile," Kael whispered, the admission sounding like it cost him a piece of his throat. "I was 17, Arielle. I bargained for her life with my silence, thinking I could find a way to bring her back once I had the power. I failed her, and I've spent every day since then failing you, but my claim on you isn't a cover-up. It's the only honest thing I've done in a decade." Chapter 11. The Traitor's Shadow. The village square was a hive of frantic activity, the scouts returning with reports of rogue movements that suggested a coordinated strike was imminent. But for Arielle, the real war was being fought in the quiet corners of the archives where she spent her nights digging through the records Julian had hinted at. Because she was now the Alpha's intended mate, the guards let her pass with only a suspicious glance, allowing her to slip into the restricted vaults beneath the Great Hall. She needed to know if her mother had truly been a victim of circumstance, or if she had been a revolutionary whose flame was extinguished too soon. She found the scrolls tucked away in a cedar box, hidden beneath a pile of old census reports that no one had touched in 40 years. The parchment was brittle, smelling of dust and dried lavender, the handwriting a graceful, looping script that made Arielle's eyes sting with sudden, hot tears. It was her mother's journal, a chronicle of the months leading up to the betrayal. As she read, the truth began to emerge from the shadows, a story far more dangerous than simple theft or political maneuvering. Her mother hadn't been framed for stealing supplies. She had been silenced because she discovered that Silas was working with the rogues to eliminate rival families within the Silver Moon. The tainted blood wasn't a curse of the line. It was a label used to mark those who refused to bow to a tyrant's secret agenda. Arielle felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her, a realization that her entire existence had been a calculated punishment designed to keep her from ever looking too closely at the throne. Because she was the last of her line, she was the only threat left to the Alpha's carefully constructed legacy. The sound of footsteps echoing in the stone corridor made her heart lurch into her throat. She shoved the scrolls into the folds of her skirt, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. A shadow fell across the doorway, not Kael's wide, protective silhouette, but the lean, predatory frame of Julian. He leaned against the doorframe, a torch in his hand casting flickering orange light over his malicious grin. "Finding what you were looking for, little wolf?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with an oily, false sympathy. It's a heavy burden, isn't it? Knowing that the man you're supposed to share a bed with is the son of the monster who devoured your world. The pack is already whispering that Kael is weak for choosing you. Imagine what they'll do when I show them the proof that your mother was the only true alpha among them. Arielle stood her ground, her jaw set in a line of iron defiance. You don't care about the truth, Julian. You just want to watch this pack tear itself apart so you can pick over the carcasses? True, Julian conceded, stepping into the room, the heat from his torch singeing the air. But that doesn't make the truth any less lethal. Tomorrow at the midpoint feast, I'm going to tell them everything. I'm going to show them that Silas is a butcher and Kael is his apprentice. Unless, of course, you decide to leave with me tonight. I can give you the revenge you crave, Arielle. I can help you burn this place to the ground. Chapter 12. The Choice of Ashes. The moon reached its zenith, bathing the village in a pale, judgmental light as the midpoint feast began in the clearing. Huge bonfires roared, sending sparks flying toward the stars like 1,000 tiny, dying suns. Arielle sat beside Kael at the high table, her body rigid, her mind a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. To her left, Silas laughed and drank, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword that had likely tasted her mother's kin's blood. To her right, Kael sat in a brooding silence, his hand reaching out under the table to find hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a desperate, silent plea for trust. Because the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and the fermented honey of the ale, the sudden arrival of Julian felt like a douse of cold, stagnant water. He marched into the center of the clearing, his warriors flanking him, their eyes glowing with a feral, expectant light. The music died a ragged death and the dancers stumbled to a halt, the silence that followed so heavy it seemed to dim the very fires. Julian didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at Silas, his smile a jagged line of victory. "We celebrate a union today," Julian shouted, his voice carrying to the furthest edges of the forest. "But how can we celebrate a bond built on the bones of a lie? Alpha Silas tells you that he purged the traitors to keep you safe. He tells you that Arielle's mother was a thief who deserved her fate. But I have seen the ledgers. I have heard the whispers of the dead." Kael surged to his feet, his chair clattering to the stone floor, his growl a low, vibrating warning that made the wolves in the front row cringe. "Sit down, Julian. You are a guest here, not a judge. Do not speak of things you do not understand." "Oh, I think I understand perfectly," Julian countered, pulling a crumpled piece of parchment from his tunic, the same record Arielle had found in the study. "I understand that the son is protecting the father's crimes. I understand that Kael claimed this girl not because of the moon goddess, but because a mate cannot testify against her alpha. He didn't save her, he silenced her." The pack erupted into a chaotic roar of confusion and burgeoning rage. Arielle felt the world tilting on its axis, the eyes of every wolf she had ever known turning toward her with a mixture of pity and accusation. She looked at Kael, waiting for him to roar a denial, to tell them that Julian was a liar and a snake. But Kael's gaze stayed fixed on the ground, his face a mask of such profound, agonizing guilt that it was the only answer the crowd needed. Because the truth was finally out in the light, Arielle realized that the love she had started to feel was the most dangerous lie of all. She stood up, her movement slow and deliberate, pulling her hand away from Kael's as if his touch were a poison. The silence returned, more brittle than before, as the girl no one wanted became the center of the storm. She didn't look at Silas, and she didn't look at Julian. She looked at the pack, her voice ringing out with a clarity that silenced the wind itself. "He's right," Arielle said, the words feeling like glass in her throat. He knew, they both knew. Chapter 13. The Fracture of Faith. The accusation hung in the freezing air like a guillotine blade, shimmering under the judgmental glare of the twin moons. Arielle's chest heaved, the cold air burning her lungs as she stared at the man she had finally begun to trust. Kael stood motionless, his shadow stretching across the flagstones like a dark stain that refused to be washed away. Because he did not immediately roar a denial, the silence of the pack transformed from shock into a low, vibrating hum of collective betrayal. The elders shifted in their seats, their faces twisted with a mixture of predatory glee and calculated concern, sensing the shift in the political winds. "Kael," Arielle whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass that cut through the silence. "Tell them he is lying. Tell me that you didn't claim me just to bury the ghost of my mother's innocence." Kael finally looked up, and for a heartbeat, the alpha heir was gone, replaced by a man drowning in the consequences of his own silence. He took a tentative step toward her, his hand outstretched, but the space between them felt like a canyon filled with the echoes of 10 years of suffering. Because he had been raised to believe that the pack's unity was a god that demanded human sacrifice, his hesitation was the only confession Arielle needed to see the truth. He looked at her with a raw, bleeding desperation, his golden eyes searching for a mercy he hadn't earned. "I didn't claim you to silence you, Arielle. I claimed you because I couldn't breathe without you," Kael rasped, his voice cracking like dry timber. "But yes, I knew. I knew my father's hands were stained, and I thought if I could just keep the peace until the crown was mine, I could fix the world he broke. I chose the pack over the truth, and in doing so, I failed the only woman who ever saw the man behind the monster." Chapter 14. The Lion and the Snake. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Silver Moon village was as brittle as scorched bone, the air thick with the scent of an impending civil war. Julian's revelation had acted like a match dropped into a pool of oil, and the resulting fire was consuming the hierarchy Arielle had spent her life fearing. She stood in the center of the village square, watching as warriors who had once shared bread now stood in divided circles, their hands resting on the hilts of their blades. Because the Alpha's authority was built on the illusion of divine justice, the proof of Silas's corruption had turned his own people into his most dangerous enemies. Silas emerged from the Great Hall, his face a mask of purple rage, his presence still formidable despite the crumbling of his reputation. He didn't look at the disgruntled pack members. He fixed his gaze on Kael, who stood at the edge of the clearing with his arms crossed, looking like a man awaiting his execution. The elder Alpha's lip curled, a low, guttural snarl vibrating in his chest as he realized his own son was the anchor dragging his legacy into the depths. Silas pointed a trembling finger at Kael, his voice booming with a desperate, dying authority. "You would let this mongrel girl and a rival Alpha destroy everything we have built?" Silas roared, the sound echoing off the stone dwellings. "I did what was necessary. I carved a future out of the chaos so that you could rule a kingdom, not a graveyard. If you had a shred of my blood in you, you would have silenced that girl the moment she began to question the order of things." Kael stepped forward, his posture no longer submissive but lethal, his wolf pressing against his skin with a visible electric intensity. "You didn't build a kingdom, Father. You built a prison and called it a pack. And the only reason I stayed silent was because I loved the crown more than I loved my soul. But I am done being the apprentice to a butcher." The tension snapped when Julian stepped forward, a scroll held high, his eyes dancing with the fire of a man who was about to win without firing a single shot. He began to read a list of names, families Silas had purged under the guise of rogue attacks, and with every name, a new growl joined the chorus of the pack's descent. Arielle watched from the sidelines, her heart a cold stone in her chest, realizing that she was no longer the victim of this story. She was the catalyst, the spark that had finally set the forest on fire to reveal the monsters hiding in the trees. Chapter 15. The Razor's Edge. The night air was heavy with the scent of ozone and coming rain, the precursor to a storm that promised to wash away the sins of the Silver Moon. Arielle sat alone in the shadows of the old healer's hut, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of a silver dagger she had taken from the armory. Because she had spent her life being the prey, the weight of the weapon in her hand felt like a dark, intoxicating promise of autonomy. She knew what was coming. She could feel the bond with Kael thrumming with a frantic, agonized frequency, a warning that he was preparing to do something that might cost him everything. She heard the soft tread of leather on dirt, and didn't need to look up to know it was Kael, his scent of rain and iron now underscored by the bitter tang of wood smoke. He stood in the doorway, the moonlight catching the scars on his chest, his expression one of a man who had already accepted his fate. He didn't come closer, respecting the wall of ice she had built between them, but his gaze was a physical weight that demanded she look at him one last time. Because he knew she was planning to leave before the full moon ceremony, his words carried the finality of a deathbed confession. "I know you're going to reject me, Arielle," Kael said, his voice a whisper that carried over the wind. "I know that after everything, my touch feels like a betrayal, and you have every right to tear the bond out of your soul and leave me to rot in the ruins of this pack. But I need you to know that I am going to the council tonight to challenge my father for the throne. Not for the power, but so I can be the one to sign the decree that clears your mother's name." Arielle gripped the dagger tighter, her knuckles white, her heart screaming at her to run to him, and her mind screaming at her to run away. "A decree won't bring her back, Kael. It won't give me back the 10 years I spent as a ghost in my own home. You think that by kneeling you can erase the fact that you stood by while they broke me? You're just like him. You think everything has a price that can be paid in blood or politics." Kael flinched as if she had struck him, his eyes shimmering with a grief so profound it made her breath hitch. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to stay. But I will not let you be the girl no one wanted anymore. When this night is over, the whole world will know that you were the only one worthy of being chosen, and I was the one who was unworthy of the choice." He turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving Arielle alone with the silver blade and the haunting realization that she held the life of the Alpha in her hands. Because the bond was still pulsing with his resolve, she felt the terrifying weight of her own power. She wasn't just a witness anymore, she was the judge, and the verdict she delivered at the full moon would either heal the pack or burn it to ashes. The first drop of rain hit the dry earth, and Arielle stood up, her decision finally hardening into a resolve that was sharper than any silver. Chapter 16. The Altar of Public Shame. The Great Clearing had been transformed into a theater of ancient judgment, illuminated by massive braziers that spat orange embers into a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Because the full moon sat fat and heavy on the horizon, the air vibrated with a primal tension that made the hair on Arielle's arms stand in rigid rows. The entire silver moon pack had gathered, forming a tight, suffocating circle around the central dais. This was the night of the claiming ceremony, the moment where Kael was supposed to cement his future. Yet the atmosphere felt less like a wedding and more like a public execution. Arielle stood on the elevated stone platform, her dusty blue dress fluttering in the freezing wind like a flag of surrender. She could feel the 1,000 eyes boring into her, some filled with the old familiar hatred, others with a new hungry curiosity. To her left, Silas sat on his carved throne, his face a mask of crumbling granite as he clutched the armrests with white-knuckled desperation. To her right, Julian leaned against a pillar, his presence a dark promise that the truth was about to become a weapon of mass destruction. Kael stepped into the light of the main fire, his chest bare and marked with the ritual oils of the Alpha lineage. He looked at Arielle, his golden eyes pleading for a mercy he clearly didn't believe he deserved. Because the bond was a screaming wire between their souls, she felt his every heartbeat, thudding with a rhythm of terror and resignation. He knelt before her, the ultimate gesture of submission for an Alpha, and the crowd let out a collective, sharp intake of breath that sounded like a winter wind through dry grass. "I, Kael of the Silver Moon, claim Arielle as my mate, my equal, and my soul," he declared, his voice booming, but carrying a tremor that only she could hear. Just as he reached for her hand to finalize the mark, Julian stepped forward, a sneer twisting his handsome features into something demonic. He threw a series of original documents onto the stone floor, the true commands for the purge signed by Silas and witnessed by a young Kael. The pack erupted into a chaotic roar of betrayal, the sound so loud it seemed to dim the very stars. Kael froze, his hand trembling just inches from her skin, his hesitation lasting only a second, but in that second, the world shattered. Chapter 17. The Severing. The roar of the crowd was a physical weight, pressing against Arielle's ears until she felt like her head might burst. She looked down at Kael, whose eyes were wide with the realization that the past had finally caught up to the present, because she saw that split-second flicker of the boy who had chosen silence over truth. The last pillar of her endurance snapped with a sound that only her heart could hear. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a storm that had finally found its path. She stepped back, her movement so sudden and violent that Kael stumbled forward, his fingers grasping at the empty air where her hand had been. The silence that followed her retreat was more terrifying than the previous noise, a vacuum of sound that sucked the warmth from the clearing. Arielle looked at the elders, then at Silas, and finally at the man kneeling in the dirt before her. She didn't use a weapon of silver. She used a weapon of words, her voice ringing out with a cold, crystalline power that silenced the very forest. "I reject you," Arielle said, the 3 words falling like stones into a bottomless well. A collective gasp ripped through the pack, followed by a low, agonizing moan from Kael as the mate bond began to fracture. Because a public rejection from a fated mate was a spiritual amputation, the air around them seemed to shimmer with the force of the soul split. Arielle felt the golden cord in her chest fray and snap, a searing agony that made her vision go white, but she refused to let her knees hit the ground. She stood tall, her shadow lengthening in the firelight, looking down at the man who had thought he could buy her forgiveness with a crown. "I will not beg to be chosen by a man who had to be forced into the light," she continued, her voice growing stronger even as her heart felt like it was being bled dry. "You say you chose me, Kael, but you only chose me when the secret was already out. I am not a prize for your redemption. I am a woman who chooses herself first, even if it means walking into the dark alone." Chapter 18. The Silence of the Fallen. The aftermath of the rejection was a landscape of emotional wreckage, the clearing feeling like a battlefield after the crows had finished their work. Kael had collapsed onto his side, his body racking with the tremors of a broken bond, his skin pale and clammy under the moonlight. The pack stood in stunned immobilization, the hierarchy they had worshipped for generations lying in pieces at their feet. Even Julian looked unsettled, the victory he had orchestrated feeling hollow in the face of Arielle's raw, uncompromising defiance. Arielle turned away from the dais, her feet moving with a mechanical precision that masked the fact that she felt like a hollow shell. She walked through the crowd, and for the first time in her life, the wolves parted for her not out of disgust, but out of a profound, terrifying respect. They saw the girl no one wanted transform into the woman who had brought an alpha to his knees. Because she had reclaimed her own narrative, the whispers that followed her were hushed and fearful, the sound of a people who realized their world was never going to be the same. She reached the edge of the clearing, the shadows of the ancient oaks reaching out to swallow her whole. She didn't look back at the fires, and she didn't look back at the man who was currently being hauled to his feet by his stunned warriors. Her chest felt cold and empty where the bond had once lived, a cavernous ache that threatened to consume her. But beneath the pain was a new, terrifying freedom. She was no longer a traitor's daughter or an alpha's mate. She was simply Arielle, a creature of the dark who had finally learned how to bite. As she disappeared into the trees, the first true howl of the night rose from the village. Not a howl of triumph, but a long, mournful cry of loss. It was Kael's voice, a sound of such absolute soul-shattering grief that it made the birds take flight from the canopy. Because the price of his silence had finally been paid in full, he was left with a throne of ashes and a heart that no longer knew its own name. The rain began to fall in earnest then, a cold, steady deluge that began to wash the ritual oils and the spilled blood into the thirsty earth. Chapter 19. The King of Ashes. The rain had turned the village into a landscape of gray mud and weeping stone, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and stayed there. Arielle sat in the corner of a small abandoned hut at the very edge of the territory, watching the horizon with eyes that felt like they had seen the end of the world. Because the bond had been severed, her chest felt like a hollowed-out cavern where a fire had recently been extinguished. She was free, truly, legally free, but the silence in her mind was a deafening roar that made it impossible to sleep. She had expected to feel a sense of triumph, yet all she felt was the heavy, leaden weight of a ghost that refused to leave. A sudden, sharp commotion from the village square pulled her from her stupor, the sound of metal clashing against metal ringing through the damp air. She stood up, her movements stiff and mechanical, and began to walk toward the center of the pack's life. As she approached the great hall, she saw a sight that made her heart stutter in its rhythm. Kael was there, but he wasn't wearing his furs or his ceremonial jewelry. He stood in the mud, drenched and shivering, holding the massive leather-bound ledger that contained the truth of his father's sins. "I am Kael, son of Silas, and I stand before you as a criminal," he shouted, his voice hoarse from the cold and the screaming grief of the broken bond. "For 10 years, this pack has thrived on the blood of the innocent, and I have been the architect of that stability. I helped my father bury the evidence of his murders, and I allowed a girl to be treated as a monster to protect a crown that was never earned." The pack watched in a stunned, terrifying silence as Kael began to read. He didn't just read the names. He told the stories of every family Silas had destroyed. He detailed the exact moments he had stayed silent, the exact ways he had manipulated the laws to keep the secrets hidden. Because he was stripping away his own protection, the warriors of the guard looked at each other with uncertainty, their hands twitching on their spear shafts. Kael wasn't fighting for the throne. He was setting it on fire while he was still sitting on it. Chapter 20. The Submission of the Alpha. The tension reached a boiling point when Silas emerged from the hall, his face a terrifying shade of crimson, his wolf snarling just beneath the surface of his skin. He lunged down the steps, his fist connecting with Kael's jaw with a sickening thud that sent the younger man sprawling into the filth. Kael didn't fight back. He wiped the blood from his lip and pushed himself back onto his knees, his eyes fixed on the pack members who were now beginning to murmur in outrage. Because he had surrendered his right to defend himself, every blow Silas landed felt like a strike against the pack's own conscience. "You are a traitor to your blood," Silas screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate, senile fury. "I did everything for you. I made you a god among these sheep, and you throw it away for a girl who doesn't even want you?" Kael looked up, his face battered and bruised, but his gaze held a clarity that Arielle had never seen before. "I am not throwing it away, Father. I am finally paying the debt. You aren't a god, and I am not your heir. I am a man who would rather die in the mud with the truth than live in a palace built on a lie." He did something then that no alpha in the history of the Silver Moon had ever done. He turned to the crowd and lowered his head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck. He wasn't asking for their loyalty. He was offering them his life as penance for his silence. The silence that followed was so profound that Arielle could hear the individual drops of rain hitting the ledger. Because the pack had been ruled by fear for so long, the sight of their future leader choosing vulnerability over power acted like a key in a rusted lock. Chapter 21. The Duel of Fate. The moment of submission was shattered when Julian, the rival alpha, stepped into the circle with a heavy broadsword in his hand. He had been waiting for this fracture, the perfect moment to eliminate the competition and claim the Silver Moon for his own. He didn't care about the truth or the ledger. He only cared about the vacancy Kael was creating. With a mocking laugh, he pointed the tip of his blade at Kael's throat, his eyes glowing with the lethal hunger of a scavenger. "A king who kneels is no king at all," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "If the Silver Moon is so desperate for a leader that they'll follow a man who begs for his life, then they deserve to be conquered. I challenge you, Kael, not for your honor, you have none left, but for the right to rule these ruins." Kael stood up slowly, his body protesting every movement, his breath coming in ragged, painful hitches. He didn't have a sword. He only had the raw, primal strength of his wolf and the desperate need to finish what he had started. He looked toward the shadows where Arielle was standing, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met. Because the bond was gone, he couldn't feel her emotions, but he could see the shift in her stance, the way she had stopped running and started watching. He took a deep, shuddering breath and shifted, the black wolf emerging from the mud with a roar that shook the very foundations of the village. The fight was a blur of teeth, fur, and the metallic ring of steel against claw. Julian was fresh and fueled by ambition, while Kael was broken and fueled by a need for redemption. They tore through the clearing, the pack scattering to avoid the carnage as the two alphas clashed in a dance of death. Kael took wound after wound, the silver of Julian's blade slicing through his black coat, but he refused to stay down. Because he was fighting for something more than a throne, he was a monster that couldn't be killed. Arielle watched as Kael lunged one final time, his jaws closing around Julian's throat with a sickening crunch. They fell together into the mud, a tangled mess of blood and fur, as the rain continued to wash over them. The pack stood frozen, the only sound the ragged, dying gasps of the rival alpha. Kael shifted back, his human form covered in deep, jagged gashes, his blood mingling with the muck of the village square. He stood over Julian's body, panting, his eyes searching the crowd until they found Arielle once again. He didn't say a word, but the question hung in the air. Had he done enough to be chosen? Chapter 22. The Heart of the Storm. The rain had slowed to a haunting drizzle, the kind that whispered against the skin like the ghosts of the fallen. In the center of the square, Kael stood hunched over, his hands braced on his knees as steam rose from his battered, bleeding shoulders. He was a king of nothing, standing in a circle of silence that felt heavier than any crown. Julian lay still in the mud, a fallen predator whose ambition had finally outrun his life. Because the hierarchy of the Silver Moon had been built on the singular pillar of alpha strength, the sight of Kael, shattered, exhausted, and yet victorious, created a vacuum of power that made the very air feel unstable. Silas sat slumped on his throne, his eyes wide and vacant as he realized that the fear he had cultivated for decades had finally evaporated. He looked at his son not with pride, but with the hollow terror of a man who knew his time had passed. The pack members began to move, a slow, tentative shifting of the crowd toward the center, their faces unreadable in the flickering torchlight. They were waiting for a sign, a direction, a reason to believe that the world hadn't just ended. Because the old laws had been burned away by Kael's confession, the wolves of the Silver Moon were truly leaderless for the first time in a century. Arielle stepped out from the shadows of the granary, her dusty blue dress stained with the soot and rain of the long night. She felt the gaze of the entire pack turn toward her, a physical pressure that made her lungs tighten. She was no longer the girl they mocked in the healer's hut, or the tainted daughter of a traitor. She was the woman who had broken the bond and, in doing so, had forced the alpha to find his soul. She walked toward Kael, her footsteps rhythmic and steady against the sodden earth, the mud splashing against her hem as she closed the distance. Kael didn't look up as she approached, his head bowed in a posture of absolute resignation. He expected a final blow, a word of banishment, or perhaps just the cold silence of her departure. Because he had surrendered everything, his power, his pride, and his legacy, he had nothing left to protect him from her judgment. Arielle stopped a foot away from him, the scent of iron and rain coming off him in thick, intoxicating waves. She looked at the man who had knelt in the muck to save a name he had helped to destroy, and she felt the last shard of her own icy armor begin to melt. Chapter 23. The Hand of Grace. The silence in the clearing was a living thing, a coiled spring of tension that seemed to vibrate with the collective heartbeat of the pack. Arielle reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched Kael's jaw, her skin feeling like fire against his cold, wet flesh. He flinched at the contact, his eyes snapping open to meet hers, the golden fire in them replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. Because the bond was gone, There was no magical pull drawing them together, only the conscious, terrifying choice of two broken people looking for a way to be whole. "You did it," she whispered, her voice carrying across the silent square with the weight of a decree. "You chose the truth when it cost you everything." Kael let out a ragged, shuddering breath, his hand coming up to cover hers, his grip desperate and grounding. "It was the only thing I had left to give you, Arielle. I don't want the throne. I don't want the power. I just want to be the man who deserved to stand beside you, even if I have to spend the rest of my life earning the right to see your face." The pack watched as Arielle did something that made the elders gasp and the warriors lower their heads in a new kind of submission. She didn't kneel to him, and she didn't wait for him to claim her. She stepped into his space, her body pressing against his heat, and she placed her palm directly over his heart. With a slow, deliberate movement, she bared her own neck, a gesture of trust that was far more powerful than any ritual of dominance. Because she was the one with the power to grant or deny his redemption, the reversal of the dynamic was complete. "I do not need to be chosen, Kael," Arielle said, her voice ringing out for everyone to hear. "I am not a prize to be won or a secret to be kept, but I see you. I see the man who knelt in the mud, and I choose to stay." She leaned forward and pressed her teeth against his shoulder, a sharp, stinging mark that wasn't an alpha's claim, but a partner's seal. A new bond flared to life, not the forced, fated connection of the moon goddess, but a bond forged in the fires of truth and mutual sacrifice. It was a warmer, deeper sensation, a golden thread that felt like a choice rather than a cage. Kael let out a sound that was half sob and half roar, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that promised to never let go. Chapter 24. The New Dawn. The first rays of dawn began to bleed over the eastern ridges, painting the village in shades of soft lavender and gold. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world smelling of fresh pine and new beginnings. Silas had been led away in chains, his trial to be presided over by a new council of elders chosen for their integrity rather than their bloodlines. The old narrative of the traitor's daughter had been officially struck from the records, replaced by a proclamation of the heroism of a woman who had saved the pack from its own shadows. Arielle stood on the steps of the great hall, her hand laced firmly in Kael's. They weren't looking down at the pack from a height of arrogance. They were standing with them, the doors of the hall thrown wide to let in the morning light. Because the fear had been replaced by a cautious, burgeoning hope, the wolves of the silver moon were beginning to talk to one another, sharing the stories that had been suppressed for a generation. The healing would be long, and the scars would remain, but the rot had finally been excised from the heart of their home. "What happens now?" Kael asked, his voice low and steady as he looked out over the valley they would now protect together. Arielle leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of the past finally feeling light enough to carry. "Now, we build a pack where love isn't a political strategy, where loyalty isn't a weapon. We build something that doesn't need to be hidden in the dark." Because she had found her own worth in the ruins of her life, Arielle no longer feared the whispers of the crowd or the weight of her own blood. She was the woman who had claimed her own destiny, and as the sun rose higher, casting long, bright shadows across the clearing, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The alpha who claimed the girl no one wanted had been a lie. The truth was far simpler and far more beautiful. They were two wolves who had chosen to walk the path together, and the forest belonged to them at last.